Good afternoon. I'm Marian Bittler, and I'm a professor of economics, and I'm the closing director of the Institute for Social Sciences. I'm going off the reservation here. I'm not going to deliver exactly the thing that was provided to me. So I'm thrilled to welcome you to the final ISS Noon Lecture. Throughout the year, we've had an opportunity to have new members of the social sciences faculty here at UC Davis come and give a talk, and I've certainly learned a lot about a lot of different areas. It's been a privilege to witness the extraordinary breadth of the groundbreaking research taking place on our campus, and we look forward to seeing the projects presented here go on to make their impacts in the world. I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge the staff at ISS, Ben Hinshaw, and especially Assistant Director Vicki Austin for all their efforts in making this series of lectures such a success, and also for everything else that they've done over the last 4 years, and also thank Joe Dumit for everything he did for ISS over all this time. Presenting for us this afternoon is Assistant Professor of Science and Technology Studies, Emily Clancher-Merchant. Emily holds a PhD in history from the University of Michigan, where she was also a pre-doctoral trainee in the Population Studies Center. Her research combines methods of close and distanced reading of archival documents, oral history interviews, and published scientific literature with approaches drawn from history, science and technology studies, the digital humanities, and the quantitative social sciences. Her current project is a history of demography since World War I. Past projects have focused on the history of immigration from Mexico to the U.S. and the history of agriculture in the U.S. West. Let's welcome Emily.
Thanks, Marian. Thanks, Vicki, for inviting me to do this, and thanks to all of you who are here at the end of the quarter. About 18 years ago, atmospheric chemist Paul Crutzen proposed that our current geological epoch be known as the Anthropocene. Meaning age of humans, the term draws attention to the fact that people have become the dominant force shaping the Earth and its environment. The human impact on the environment has been particularly evident since 1950, which is represented by the dotted line here, and marks the beginning of the period that scholars of the Anthropocene have dubbed the Great Acceleration. Images like these link socioeconomic trends to alarming Earth system consequences. Population growth takes a prominent place in the upper left corner, apparently driving the whole situation. The creators of these images have since updated them to acknowledge that although the socioeconomic trends that have devastated the Earth system were centered on the OECD countries, or the global north, the simultaneous growth in population was concentrated in the rest of the world, or the global south. So population growth is not the primary driver of our current crisis. Nonetheless, population growth and ecosystem degradation are indelibly linked in the American popular consciousness. The villain of Infinity War, the most recent Marvel movie, becomes almost sympathetic when we learn that his motivation to kill half the inhabitants of the galaxy is environmental. The conceptual linkage between population growth and ecosystem degradation is itself a product of the Great Acceleration, when the world's population grew at unprecedented rates and the environmental effects of unbridled capitalism became readily apparent. It was during this period that environmentalists began to call for population control, and population controllers began to point to the environment to justify their activities. The Great Acceleration also saw the rise of a new social science of population known as demography. Although both environmentalists and population controllers called on demography for scientific legitimacy, demographers themselves had little to say about the environment. In 1998, demographer Ann Pebley devoted her presidential address at the annual meeting of the Population Association of America to the question of why demographers had not engaged substantively with environmental issues. 20 years later, just this past April, former PAA President Amy Choi lamented the fact that although demography had diversified considerably in the last 50 years, branching out into a wide variety of research areas, the one area we somehow never captured, and maybe we need a celebrity for this, so to speak, an advocate, is environment, the linkages between population and environment. This talk has 3 parts. In the first part, I'll use topic modeling to quantify and track environmental language in the Anglophone demography journal literature during the second half of the 20th century. In the second part, I'll draw on archival research and oral history from my book In Progress on the history of American demography to explain why demographers weren't engaging with the environment when environmentalists were engaging with population. I argue that demographers were working from a different model of population than the one available to the American public, and that these models became part of separate Cold War narratives of overpopulation. In the third part, I'll very briefly discuss how the natural environment has begun to enter the demography journal literature in the last 30 years. How demographers have and have not talked about population and the environment is important because although demographers have had tremendous influence on population thought and policy worldwide, they've never had a monopoly on how publics, policymakers, or even other scientists have understood population. So part one. And to answer this question, I fit a topic model to a corpus that includes all English language articles in JSTOR published between 1915 and 2013 that were classified as population studies and social science. As you can see in this graph, articles in demography journals comprise a small fraction of the corpus, so the demography journals are in red. Demography is an interdisciplinary field that focuses on human population dynamics in the aggregate. Demographers use quantitative methods to examine the determinants of vital rates, fertility, mortality, and migration, and the consequences of trends in those rates. They're typically trained in interdisciplinary population centers that currently exist in about 29 universities, and most demographers hold a PhD in sociology or economics. Because demography is an interdiscipline, demographers publish outside of demography journals, and demography journals publish work that isn't necessarily by demographers. Nonetheless, I'll be assuming that the demography journals are broadly representative of the field, and I'll compare them to population-oriented articles in other journals. To identify environmental language in the corpus, I fit a topic model using the mallet package for R, which is latent Dirichlet allocation. Topic modeling answers the following question. If we imagine that a given set of documents was constructed from an arbitrary number of pre-existing vocabularies, what would those vocabularies be? The latent Dirichlet allocation algorithm determines these vocabularies by identifying patterns of words that appear together in the same documents. As an example from the model I fit to this corpus, the cluster of words on the left is a vocabulary of fertility, and the cluster of words on the right is a vocabulary of mortality. These are what are referred to as topics, these vocabularies. Each topic is a probability distribution over words, weighted by the frequency with which they appear in the context of the other words in the topic. As you can see when I graph the weight of the 10 most prevalent words in each topic, the word birth appears in both, but is much more common in the fertility topic than in the mortality topic. It would be used in mortality analysis when talking about things like the expectation of life at birth. And as you can see, life is the most common word in that vocabulary. The proportions in which the words occur and the words with which they co-occur are what make these vocabularies distinct. The user specifies the number of topics they're looking for, but not what those topics should look like or represent. What you get in the end is the weighted list of words that comprise each topic and the proportion of words in each document that was assigned to each topic. The ideal number of topics in a topic model depends on the research question. In the model I fit to this corpus, I used 200 topics because that was what it took to identify environmental language, and these are the two topics in which environmental language appears. With fewer than 100 topics, there was none that distinctly referred to the natural environment. With between 100 and 200 topics, the topic on the left, general environmental vocabulary, was discernible, but the topic on the right, which is more specific to land use and deforestation, was not. And the numbers at the bottom are just how the algorithm identifies the topic. They carry no substantive meaning. All the results I'll be showing today are from the same 200 topic model, and if there's time at the end, I'll be happy to answer more questions about how I fit it. These environmental topics appear in articles like this one, which is about the relationship between rainfall and migration from rural Mexico to the United States. So these are the 6 topics that appear most frequently in the article. The 2 environmental topics together comprise 21% of the article. Topic 123, which is a vocabulary of quantitative analysis, accounts for another 19% of the article. Topic 82 is a vocabulary of migration from Mexico to the United States. That accounts for 14% of the article. Topic 28 is a more general vocabulary of migration. That's another 14%. And topic 75 is vocabulary of change over time, and that accounts for another 5% of the article. And the remaining 27% of the article comes from the other 194 topics in the model, so that's kind of how to understand the model. And this is just an example of the kind of results the model gives for every article. Aggregating them indicates trends over time and allows me to compare the content of different segments of the corpus. This graph shows the proportion of demography journals and other journals accounted for by the 2 environmental topics during the period of the Great Acceleration. I've used a 5-year moving average to smooth out year-to-year fluctuations and show general trends. As you can see, the environmental topics account for less than 0.5% of the corpus prior to 1985 and are more prevalent outside of the demography journals. This means that articles about population in non-demography journals were more likely to reference the natural environment than were articles in demography journals. The lines cross around 1983, and then environmental topics become much more prevalent in the demography journals. Their prevalence increases in the other journals as well, but more modestly. And to get a better sense of what's going on, we can look specifically at the demography journals. The bottom graph here shows all the articles in demography journals. And as you can see, the growth in articles has largely come from the establishment of new journals over time. The upper graph shows the number of article equivalents in each journal that are comprised by the two environmental topics. What I mean by article equivalents is that if some percentage of an article is assigned by the model to one of the environmental topics, it counts as that percentage of an article in this graph. And the main story here is that when environmental language does start to appear in larger amounts in demography journal literature, it's in two relatively new journals, Population and Development Review and Population and Environment. And I'll discuss these two journals in the third part of the talk. The question for part 2 is why demographers were not saying very much about the environment during this period, at a time when the world's population was growing dramatically, when environmental degradation was becoming a major social issue, and when books linking population to environment were selling millions of copies. And these books included Road to Survival by William Vogt and Our Plundered Planet by Fairfield Osborne, which were both published in 1948. The Population Bomb by Paul Ehrlich, published in 1968, and Limits to Growth by the Club of Rome in 1972. So part 2. Both sides of this question require explanation. Why did population growth become a popular scapegoat for environmental degradation, and why were demographers relatively late in addressing environmental issues in the second half of the 20th century? And here I'll be drawing on archival research from my book In Progress on the history of American demography in the mid-20th century to argue that the model of population demographers were working with was different from the one in circulation among the American public, policymakers, and other scientists, and that these models developed into separate narratives of overpopulation after World War II. In the United States, demography coalesced between the world wars. Advocates for a trio of political projects, eugenics, immigration restriction, and birth control legalization, looked to scientists who were working on human population to support their agendas. These scientists came from a variety of fields and used their research on human population growth to advocate for or against the same 3 political projects. Scientists and activists together formed the Population Association of America in 1931. Over the next few years, they defined population science and negotiated the terms of its relationship with the political projects that called it into being. The scientists who formed PAA shared a common understanding of what a population was. It was the people counted in a country's census. But they disagreed over the scope of the new field they were creating. One side focused on population growth in the aggregate and its relationship to natural resources. These scientists theorized a Malthusian relationship whereby population growth put pressure on natural resources and resource availability determined population growth. Advocates for this view were mainly natural scientists, such as biologist Raymond Pearl, and older social scientists who lacked statistical training, such as Henry Pratt Fairchild. The other side focused on vital rates, that is, fertility, mortality, and migration rates, which were thought to be determined by social, economic, and political institutions. Advocates for this view included statisticians, such as Alfred Lotka, and younger statistically trained social scientists, such as Frank Notestein. Everyone recognized that all 4 factors were at play. The question was which perspective the new field would take. It mattered because these 2 perspectives produced different understandings of interwar population change in the United States and supported different political agendas. In the aggregate, the US population was growing, but new vital rate indices developed in the 1920s suggested that the US population wouldn't be growing for long. One of these measures, which demographers continue to use today, is the net reproduction rate. The net reproduction rate summarizes age-specific mortality and fertility rates into a number that represents how many people in the next generation will replace each person in the present generation. A net reproduction rate of 1 is replacement fertility and indicates that if mortality and fertility rates remain constant for a period of about 70 years, the population will achieve stationarity, meaning that it's neither growing nor shrinking. If mortality and fertility rates are changing, the net reproduction rate says nothing about whether a population is currently growing, shrinking, or remaining constant. In the 1930s, the net reproduction rate in the United States fell below 1, meaning that fertility was below the rate of replacement, even as population continued to grow in the aggregate. Scientists who looked at aggregate population warned that population growth would soon reach the limits of natural resources. Those who looked at vital rates saw a population that would stop growing well within those limits. Scientists who focused on aggregate rates marshaled them in support of immigration restriction and eugenic sterilization laws. Among the scientists who focused on vital rates, some advocated against immigration restriction, while others aligned themselves with a new version of eugenics that purged itself of overt racism and nativism and that relied on family planning rather than compulsory sterilization. The phrase family planning was new at this time, and it wasn't exactly a euphemism for birth control. It signaled birth control in the context of social control that promoted large families among those who were supposedly hereditarily superior and small families among those who were supposedly hereditarily inferior, but without overt coercion. Both groups of scientists contributed to the formation of the PAA, but vital rates quickly became the centerpiece of the new field of demography. In contrast to aggregate growth, which was apparent to anyone who looked at census data, determining and understanding indices like the net reproduction rate required substantial quantities of data that were just becoming available and specialized training that was unique to the scientists who were beginning to call themselves demographers. The ability to calculate and interpret this type of index became the basis for demographers' claims to epistemic authority in the realm of population. It was the statistically trained social scientists whose work would come to define the field and who would train future generations. They were also the ones who were able to attract financial support to demography, as their quantitative work fit the objectivist style favored by the private foundations that funded the majority of social science research at the time. This graph shows that in the post-war period, rate-based vocabularies, so vocabularies that are focused on vital rates, were much more prevalent in demography journals than in population-oriented scholarship in other journals. But the aggregate model of population didn't go away. It formed the basis for claims made about population by an organization established in 1929, the Population Reference Bureau. The Bureau's goal was to shape American public opinion regarding population by producing and circulating summaries of population research in a form that journalists could easily understand and pass along to their audiences. Its founder, Guy Irving Birch, was a staunch nativist and supporter of old-school eugenics, and he recruited a board of directors from among the natural scientists and older social scientists who took an aggregate view of population and shared Birch's political commitments. The materials circulated by the Bureau drew indiscriminately on cutting-edge and outdated population research to promote the public perception of a rapidly growing U.S. population straining at the limits of natural resources. Even though the net reproduction rate showed below replacement fertility, Birch declared that the United States was in the midst of a population explosion. And I think that was the first use of that phrase. He described the demographic measures that suggested otherwise as a conspiracy to undermine immigration restriction by, and this is a quote, small fry academics led by foreign-born scientists. As demographic scholarship became less readily comprehensible to the general public, the Population Reference Bureau exercised considerable influence over how the public understood population issues. During World War II, American demographers and population activists turned their attention to global population. By the end of the war, it appeared that the world's population would grow in the second half of the century, and over the next 2 decades, the magnitude of that growth continued to exceed expectation. The 2 interwar models of population growth gave rise to 2 separate Cold War narratives about global overpopulation and 2 sets of policy responses. The demographers' post-war narrative centered on a new theory of population growth known as demographic transition. Demographic transition theory developed in tandem with modernization theory. It proposes that the modernization process drives a decline in the mortality rate, which is the red line, followed by a decline in the fertility rate, which is the blue line. The lag between mortality decline and fertility decline generates a brief period of aggregate population growth, which is this black line. But the outcome is a stationary population with low mortality and high living standards. Demographic transition theory explained low interwar fertility rates in the United States as a natural outcome of the modernization of such social institutions as the economy and the family. Demographers pointed to the US as exemplary of a post-transitional society, waving away the baby boom as cyclical fluctuation around a low fertility baseline. And you can see on the blue line that this fluctuation is part of the model. Demographers were unconcerned about the aggregate growth that occurred in the demographic transition process, focusing instead on the achievement of low fertility and mortality rates, which were understood as a sign that population was well within the bounds of any limits posed by the natural world. If you Google demographic transition, you'll get hundreds of images like this one, but a lot of them leave out the line for total population, emphasizing the decline in vital rates rather than the aggregate increase. Demographers expected the spread of industry to affect demographic transition worldwide, and they called for decolonization in order to speed this process in the global south. But they didn't question whether the Earth could withstand the industrialization required to make the entire world look like the United States, both economically and demographically. By the end of the war, it was clear that some countries in Asia and the Caribbean were experiencing mortality decline and population growth outside the context of demographic transition. Demographers viewed this growth as a problem, not because the world's population was in danger of exceeding natural limits, but because rapid population growth in developing countries could divert income from capital accumulation to feeding and clothing babies, and thereby prevent the industrialization that would trigger demographic transition. By the early 1950s, they had also begun to worry that a delay in the transition process, especially in the context of rapid population growth, made poor countries vulnerable to communist revolution and therefore a threat to global stability. They updated demographic transition theory to suggest that the relationship between vital rates and social institutions went in both directions. Modernization of social, economic, and political institutions would reduce fertility, but an exogenous decline in fertility could also stimulate modernization. The Population Council, a major sponsor of demography research and training after World War II, pointed to demographic studies to convince the leaders of rapidly growing countries to establish family planning programs. The same demographers who had supported family planning as a eugenic measure in the United States between the wars insisted that fertility decline in the global south could not be coerced or legislated. It could only be brought about through the introduction of birth control in a social context that attributed poverty to high fertility and promised that small families would generate prosperity at the individual level and economic development at the national level. Demography's Cold War overpopulation narrative had three key elements that differentiated it from the other narrative, which I'll describe in a minute. First, overpopulation was localized. It was only a problem in the global south, where rapid population growth was thought to prevent modernization. Second, the United States was exemplary of the modern demographic balance that accompanied industrialization. And third, the provision of family planning programs could reduce fertility in the global south enough to trigger economic development. The Population Council circulated this narrative among high fertility countries by offering fellowships for students from those countries to study demography in the United States. The other Cold War overpopulation narrative, which was circulated within the United States by the Population Reference Bureau, held that the world was already overpopulated. It took as evidence the environmental degradation that had begun to enter the American public consciousness during the Great Depression. According to this narrative, the United States too was overpopulated and continuing to grow. Its proponents argued that all population growth needed to cease and that the United States should legislate childbearing limits for its own population and use its new geopolitical power to force other countries to do the same. The environmental narrative originated with Birch and the Population Reference Bureau, but it reverberated in the media and was adopted by segments of the environmental movement. It was already present in its entirety in a book Birch published in 1945 titled Human Breeding and Survival: Population Roads to Peace or War. In it, Birch argued that the world had already passed its carrying capacity of 2 billion people. He blamed population growth for every recent calamity, from war to soil erosion, and every calamity became evidence of overpopulation. Birch's particular target was economic regulation. He saw in the New Deal tyranny creeping into the United States, necessitated by the resource scarcity and ecosystem degradation caused by overpopulation. His solution was to regulate the reproduction of the poor worldwide in order to protect the economic freedom of the wealthy. Just before Birch's death in 1951, the environmental narrative gained a powerful new proponent, Dixie Cup inventor Hugh Moore. Moore published a pamphlet in 1954 titled The Population Bomb, which updated Birch's human breeding and survival for the Cold War era. It warned that population growth would facilitate the global spread of communism. In full-page ads in major newspapers, Moore demanded U.S. government intervention to limit population growth in Asia and Latin America. He wasn't concerned with the environment per se, but when he got frustrated that the American public wasn't paying enough attention to the dangers of population growth overseas, he began publishing ads like this one, which brought population growth home and linked it to increasingly popular environmental issues. Birch and Moore used the growing awareness of environmental degradation instrumentally to support their contention that the world as a whole, and the United States specifically, were already overpopulated. But as public concern with the environment grew, their overpopulation narrative provided a handy explanation and a relatively straightforward solution. The 1948 publication of Road to Survival by William Vogt and Our Plundered Planet by Fairfield Osborne launched the modern environmental movement. These books placed population growth at the center of the environmental crisis, citing Birch's human breeding and survival as evidence that the world's population had exceeded its natural limits. They echoed Birch's call for the United States government to limit the growth of its own population and incorporate population control into its foreign policy. Both books sold millions of copies and were translated into several languages. Road to Survival was selected for Book of the Month Club and remained the most popular environmental book until the 1962 publication of Silent Spring. Natural scientists, notably biologists Paul Ehrlich and Garrett Hardin, incorporated this narrative into popular and scientific texts. Ehrlich's 1968 Population Bomb took its title directly from Moore's pamphlet and combined Moore's warnings about the spread of communism with the environmental themes of Road to Survival and Our Plundered Planet, which he had read as a college student at the University of Pennsylvania. Hardin, who's most famous for his 1968 article Tragedy at the Commons, argued that the world's environmental crisis could be solved only by cutting off aid to the poor, both in the United States and abroad. Ehrlich's population bomb gave rise to the zero population growth movement. Borrowing slogans from Moore's advertising campaign, ZPG called for an end to population growth in the United States as a means of protecting the environment and demanded population control abroad to prevent communist revolution. But its leaders faced a quandary. What did they mean by zero growth? They initially defined it as replacement fertility. By 1972, that goal had been reached in the United States, and newspapers proclaimed that the country had achieved zero growth, despite the fact the population was still rising in the aggregate. As membership in ZPG began to dwindle, its leaders turned their attention to immigration, which had become a major source of population growth in the wake of the 1965 immigration reform. ZPG drew on new demographic and environmental concerns to argue that immigration was bad for the environment, not only because it increased the size of the U.S. population directly, but because the majority of immigrants were coming from the global south, where fertility rates were higher and consumption rates lower. According to ZPG's logic, immigrants would retain the higher fertility rates of their countries of origin and adopt the higher consumption rates of the United States, inflating the U.S. population beyond their own numbers and making a larger contribution to environmental degradation than if they had remained at home. This kind of racism and nativism had been part of the environmental narrative all along, running through its key texts from Human Breeding and Survival in 1945 to the Population Bomb in 1968. And returning to the graphs we saw before of environmental language, we can see that demographers were talking about the environment a little bit, particularly in the years right after the publication of Road to Survival and Our Plundered Planet, and right around the publication of the Population Bomb. As a proportion of the corpus, and this is the same graph I showed before, demographers' use of environmental language follows the same pattern as other journals, just at a lower level. The use of environmental language we see in the demography journals includes both demographers who supported the environmental narrative and those who opposed it. A small number of demographers did take up the environmental argument against population growth, particularly Kingsley Davis and his former student Lincoln Day. Davis was one of the most prominent demographers of his generation and one of the architects of demographic transition theory. He lacked the statistical prowess of his contemporaries, but was much more adept with social theory, and he operated largely outside the orbit of the Population Council. Davis was among the very few demographers who responded positively to Road to Survival and Our Plundered Planet. He joined the board of the Population Reference Bureau after their publication and later served on the board of Zero Population Growth. Leading the opposition to the environmental narrative were Frank Notstein and Ansley Cole, who were both as prominent as Davis, if not more. Both were also closely aligned with the Population Council. They acknowledged the world was in the midst of a rapidly worsening environmental crisis, but they attributed it to human activities rather than human numbers and called for more direct solutions than population control. In this period, Notstein, Cole, and other mainstream demographers generally addressed the environment only as part of a broader critique of the policy aims connected to the environmental overpopulation narrative. Of the 24 articles in the corpus by Frank Notstein and the 14 articles by Ansley Cole published between 1945 and 1974, only these two include the environmental topic from the model, and none includes the land use topic. The environmental topic accounts for about 2.5% of Cole's article and almost 9% of Notstein's. Both articles dismissed population growth as a direct cause of environmental degradation, rejected the idea that the United States needed a policy to limit its population, and offered support for the Population Council's programs of promoting family planning in the Global South as a means of stimulating economic development. So the environmental language that we do see, some of it is in support of the environmental overpopulation narrative, and some of it is in opposition. And the two Cold War narratives of overpopulation were distinct but not independent of one another. The demographic narrative targeted public opinion and population policy in high fertility countries, while the environmental narrative targeted public opinion and foreign and domestic policy in the United States. The Population Council helped the Population Reference Bureau secure funding, and the work of the Population Reference Bureau generated public support in the United States for the overseas family planning programs of the Population Council. The line between those programs and the forms of population control advocated by the Population Reference Bureau were often blurry, and while the environmental narrative displayed its racial anxieties above the surface, those of the demographic narrative were barely submerged. Moving on to part 3. And in this section, I'm just going to give a very brief explanation of why the amount of environmental language in demography journals increased so dramatically in the 1980s. And as we saw before, the environmental language appears mainly in two journals that first appear in this later period: Population and Development Review and Population and Environment. Population and Development Review was launched by the Population Council in 1975 in an attempt to reassert the relevance of population to development after the 1974 World Population Conference, when leaders of high fertility countries rejected family planning as a route to economic development. PDR explicitly aimed for accessibility, jettisoning much of the quantitative language that characterized existing demography journals. So these graphs compare the amount of quantitative language in Population and Development Review in the blue line to demography and population studies in the red and orange lines. And this topic 13 is a vocabulary of event history analysis and proportional hazards regression, and this topic 128 is a more general regression vocabulary. Just to show that this journal is much less quantitative than the other two. In search of new rationales for population policy, PDR also engaged the environmental narrative of overpopulation. And these graphs show the prevalence of the environmental topics in PDR as compared to population studies and demography. There's a spike in both topics in the late 1980s and early 1990s when PDR published a series of annual supplements on population and resources. And the third supplement in the series was edited by Kingsley Davis and included an article by Virginia Abernethy, who had just become editor of the relatively new Population and Environment. And Abernethy is not a demographer. The Southern Poverty Law Center describes her as a professor emeritus of psychiatry and anthropology at Vanderbilt University who pushes repugnant race-based politics from behind an academic veneer. And this particular article cites environmental degradation as evidence of global overpopulation and contends that redistribution, either of resources through foreign aid or of population through immigration, will only worsen overpopulation and the resulting pressure on the environment. Population and Environment was initially launched by the American Psychological Association as an outlet for research on the social environment as a determinant of fertility and other demographic behavior. It examined issues that demographers typically neglected, such as sexuality, here in topic 1, and sexual relationships in topic 25. It really didn't deal much with the natural environment until Abernethy became editor in the late 1980s. So that's when these lines start shooting upwards. Before that, there's not much going on in terms of environment. And at this point, the journal seems to have broken its ties to the APA. Abernethy remained editor until 1998, when she was replaced by psychologist Kevin MacDonald, who the Southern Poverty Law Center describes as the neo-Nazi movement's favorite academic. During Abernethy's editorship, the journal had a heavy emphasis on immigration, as you can see in the graphs of these two topics. And it's not clear from the topic model exactly what was being said about immigration in this journal, but each issue during this period included an editorial from Abernethy, most of which were explicitly nativist. And during the MacDonald period, the journal became an outlet for the racist evolutionary scholarship of people like Richard Lynn and J. Philippe Rushton, who were supported by the overtly racist Pioneer Fund. A few demographers published in Population and Environment during this period, despite its white nationalist bent. And some probably didn't notice the journal's political commitment, while others hoped that they could change its tenor simply by submitting quality scholarship. The new scholarship that was beginning to appear here and in some mainstream demography journals considered environmental determinants of vital processes, expanding demographic models to include the natural world. This article that I showed earlier is an example of the new environmental demography, though it wasn't published in Population and Environment. Demographers doing this kind of work were members of a new generation who had grown up during the environmental movement and had entered the field after demography expanded beyond its initial narrow focus on affecting demographic transition in the Global South. Around 2004, these scholars worked with Springer, who publishes Population and Environment, to take control of the journal, replace its editorial board, redesign its cover, rewrite its mission statement, clear out its publishing queue, and turn it into a reputable demography journal. Since then, its editors have fostered the development of high-quality, non-racist research that explores specific micro-level links between environmental and demographic processes. Nonetheless, the history of this journal indicates that the environmental overpopulation narrative has remained quite powerful and continues to provide shelter to racism and nativism. And in conclusion, although the environmental population narrative called on the new field of demography for scientific legitimacy, demographers generally refrain from participating. Topic modeling demonstrates that through much of this period, their scholarship engaged less with the environment than did that of other social scientists writing about population. When environmental language did enter the demography literature in the late 1980s, it was through new journals that were initially on the margins of the field. Demography's scientific authority depended on models of population change that were not readily apprehended by the public, by policymakers, or even by other scientists, and that emphasized future stationarity rather than present growth. These models focused on the relationship between population dynamics and economic development, excluding from analysis the effects of economic development on the natural world. Their proponents fought over population on the terrain of the public opinion and population policy of high fertility countries, ceding the ground of American public opinion to the environmental narrative. The concept of the Anthropocene has inspired natural scientists, social scientists, and humanists to think together about the relationship between human, social, and geological processes. Yet its terminology threatens to recuperate the environmental overpopulation narrative, attributing environmental degradation to human nature or human numbers, rather than the specific activities that have simultaneously commodified and devalued the natural world. For this reason, humanists and social scientists have proposed alternative terminology, including Plantationocene and Capitalocene, to emphasize that our current crisis is the result of activities that have benefited a few at the expense of many more. The new environmental demography also has the potential to disrupt the environmental overpopulation narrative, as it emphasizes the environment as a causal factor in population processes. But as we've seen, demography's approaches to population have often been opaque to those outside the field. In the mid-20th century, the thick quantitative walls demographers built around their field allowed them to assert their unique authority to analyze population. It allowed them to claim objectivity as they promoted controversial policies, and it allowed them to deflect the critiques of modernization theory that were developing in neighboring fields. Demography has now expanded well beyond its initial narrow focus on fertility and economic development, and it may be time for demographers to make their models more accessible to the public, to policymakers, and perhaps especially to the other scientists who are grappling with the relationship of human beings to the natural world. Thanks. Questions?
I have maybe just one quick clarifying question. Can you state again how you parse out your analysis of the literature that's specific to, that under topics of population, and then how you compare that to non-demography journals? Because it seemed like what you were analyzing as population focused or demography journals, was that just the few number of journals, or because it seemed like it included like a lot, right? So I'm curious how is it split by certain journal bodies? Or bodies?
Yeah, so let's see, I can. Let me see all this.
And maybe while you're pulling that up, I'm curious because what about fields that are like human ecology, for example, where there's clearly, where do those kind of people and those kind of fields kind of sit in with this?
Yeah, so that's actually a really good question. So this was something that I actually struggled with for a long time when I was trying to figure out how to compare demography with other scholarship, not just in this talk, but for other work that I've done, because demography is really interdisciplinary. So in the graph that I showed, these are the journals that I classified as demography. And so some of these are the core demography journals that were started by the Population Association of America journals, but part of it is just kind of knowing the corpus and knowing that the Milbank Memorial Fund Quarterly really was an outlet for demography scholarship from the 1930s until about 1971, and it stopped. And that was because the Milbank Memorial Fund was a major sponsor of demographic research, and it had its own kind of in-house demography department until the last person retired in 1971. So kind of just knowing which ones, but then so the question of this graph looks very different if I consider population and environment to be a demography journal rather than if I don't. And the reason why I did is because it's kind of looking like a demography journal. It has a title that demographers view as kind of their own, even if they're not publishing in it. And it is now a demography journal. So these journals are kind of changing character over time. But then the real question was, what about going back? Up here, comparing demography to everything else. And what about journals about marriage and family, like the Journal of Marriage and Family? A lot of demographers publish in there. Journals about family planning, journals about migration, demographers do publish in there. And the reason why I ended up separating them out was in part just to keep the analysis tractable. So when I'm looking at what are the demography journals, I don't have, I have 15 rather than 50, but also because these journals are less likely to have people talking about the environment. So if I were to include them, it would actually make demography look even more different, and I didn't want to kind of prejudice the analysis in that way. Joe?
Well, as you were beginning your talk, I started to think, oh, we should start more journals. It started me thinking about, have you looked at like citations, right? Quote citations, or like when you show the demography journals and the influence of demography in the environment, given your method, are other demographers picking this up? I mean, have you looked at do those articles get cited? Do they have any influence on demography outside of that journal?
Yeah, and that's actually something that I haven't looked at yet. So the citation indices generally started around 1968 for social science, and most of my research has been before that, so I haven't looked. But for this particular question, since so much of it is after 1968, I think that would be a really, really great next thing to look at. And from reading them, you can tell, that they're referencing So these two articles that I showed before. These two articles, so these both started out as presentations at the Population Association of America. Ansley Cole was president in 1968, and his presidential address was basically the United States should not start a campaign for fewer births. And this was also this wasn't a presidential address, but it was a PAA paper. And so you can tell, reading them, that they're absolutely talking about Paul Ehrlich and the population bomb, even though they never actually cite him by name. So it would be interesting to look at the actual citations.
Yeah. So how do you suggest that demographic models be made more accessible?
Yeah, that's a
Given
really
that was a
good question.
conclusion, I feel like it's a fair question.
Yeah, absolutely. And so kind of something that I have in mind is so the Population Association of America, the 2011 presidential address was by economist David Lamb, and his title of his presidential address was "How Did the World Survive the Population Bomb?" And so it starts from this premise: the population bomb is over, we survived. Population growth is coming to a halt, no problem. The very next summer, the New York Times published this huge kind of five article series on how we're still in the midst of the population bomb. And so there's still this huge kind of disconnect between demographers who are really looking at approaching stationarity, looking at vital rates, and kind of the public, environmental scientists, policymakers who are still seeing aggregate growth. And so, and I think both views are incomplete. And so, yeah, so I don't know exactly how demographers can make their, other than maybe just putting them out in the public more. That was kind of how the Population Reference Bureau got its version out, was by sending out press releases, by making materials for the public. And I think one way that demographers have done this just this year actually was in the kind of outcry against the citizenship question in the census. A lot of demographers wrote articles for the popular press, talking about why this is bad for demographic research, among other things.
One more question?
I guess I do have a question. I hesitate to ask it because this is outside of my field, but it seems like a lot of the discussion around, overpopulation environment has related to like animals and habitat loss. And when I'm looking at your word cloud, I can't see it that well, but I don't see words like animal or extinction or habitat. I'm just wondering, are you taking like the animal world into consideration when you're putting together the model, when you're configuring environment? Because I see more like land and climate and, sort of like the non-living side of the natural world.
Yeah, so I haven't looked specifically at how demographers have looked at the kind of the animal world, but with topic modeling, I don't create this. This is kind of an outcome of the model. Topic modeling assumes that there are topics underlying the corpus, but that we don't know in advance what they are, and the algorithm kind of discovers them by seeing what words appear together. And I didn't have time for it in the main talk, but I had some extra slides about how I determined kind of which were the environmental topics. And so what I did was I was looking for any topics that included these words. So I wasn't specifically looking for words like habitat, but I was looking for like ecosystem. And when I had a model with 50 topics, these were the only topics that included those words. And so they weren't, there wasn't a topic, this is like I said before, there really wasn't a topic that was kind of the natural environment. And when I got to 100 topics, there was one that appeared, and it has things like forest. I didn't look into the the whole list of words to see what kind of like habitats, things like that. But then this land topic is kind of the one that's more about deforestation and things like that. And what's interesting here is that this land topic appeared when I got to a 200 topic model, and it didn't split off from this other one, as far as I can tell. These were two, so this graph shows the amount of the corpus that is accounted for by the environment topics in each model. And as you can see, the land topic, this topic 66, is kind of an additional chunk of the corpus that's accounted for. So this land topic was not subsumed within this environmental topic, it was separate. So it is possible that language about about habitats, about the animal world, could have been kind of subsumed in other topics and not appearing here, but it's not something I looked for specifically. Thank you so much. Thanks.